A pregnant woman with triplets is abandoned by her wealthy fiancé, and years later, he discovers that she is the heiress to a fortune and tries to gain custody of the children. The scream of pain echoed off the white walls of the hospital, followed by the unmistakable sound of a slap. Margaret Mason, her face contorted with agony and tears streaming down her cheeks, stared incredulously at the man who, until a few minutes ago, she considered the love of her life. "How can you do this to me, Tony? With our children?" she whispered, her voice laced with emotion and the pain of rapidly approaching contractions. Tony Prescott III straightened his silk tie, his face a mask of coldness and disdain. "Don't be naive, Margaret. Did you really think that I, heir to the Prescott Empire, would marry a waitress?" The words hit Margaret like a punch in the gut. She remembered the day she met Tony in the cafe where she worked in Boston. He was charming, sophisticated, and seemed genuinely interested in her. The months that followed were like a fairy tale: dinners in expensive restaurants, weekend trips to New York, promises of eternal love. When she found out she was pregnant with triplets, Tony asked her to marry him, and Margaret believed that her dream had come true. Now, at 25, 38 weeks pregnant and about to give birth, she found herself alone, betrayed and abandoned. "But you said you loved me," Margaret muttered, still unable to process the cruelty of the situation. Tony laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "Love, darling, it was fun while it lasted, but you were never more than a distraction. My father made it very clear. Either I break up with you, or I can kiss my inheritance goodbye." At that moment, another contraction hit Margaret with full force. She bent over the hospital bed, moaning in pain. Tony took a step back, as if he feared being contaminated by her anguish. "Don't worry about money," he said, taking an envelope from his inside jacket pocket and throwing it on the bed. "This should cover your expenses for a while. Consider it a going-away present." With those words, he turned to leave, but Margaret mustered the strength to speak one last time. "Tony, please. They're your children." He paused for a moment, his hand on the door handle. For a brief moment, Margaret saw a glimmer of hesitation in his eyes, but as quickly as it appeared, the doubt was gone, replaced by the same coldness as before. "No, Margaret, they're your children now." The door closed behind him, leaving Margaret alone with her pain, both physical and emotional. The contractions were becoming more intense and frequent. She pressed the nurse's call button, knowing that her babies were about to come into the world. As the medical team rushed into the room, Margaret made a silent promise to herself and her unborn children. She would be strong for them, love them unconditionally, and do everything in her power to give them a good life, even if she had to do it alone. The next few hours were a whirlwind of pain, exhaustion, and, finally, indescribable joy when Margaret heard her babies first cry. 3 perfect little girls, each with a small lock of auburn hair like her own. "Sophia, Ava, and Mia," she whispered, kissing each of her newborn daughters. "It's us against the world now, my little ones." While Margaret marveled at her daughters, on the other side of Boston, Tony Prescott III entered his office at Prescott Enterprises. His father, Tony Prescott II, was waiting for him with a stern expression. "Is it done?" the older man asked bluntly. Tony nodded, pouring himself a glass of whiskey. "Yes, Dad. Margaret is out of our lives." "Good," his father replied, visibly relaxing. "You made the right choice, son. Remember, sentimentality has no place in business or in the life of a Prescott." Tony raised his glass in a silent toast, ignoring the voice in his head, screaming that he had made the biggest mistake of his life. Meanwhile, in the hospital, Margaret looked out of her bedroom window, watching the lights of Boston glow in the night. Her daughters were sleeping peacefully in their cribs beside the bed. The envelope Tony had left behind remained untouched. "We don't need his money," Margaret murmured to her daughters. "Let's build our own lives, far away from here." That night, while the town slept, Margaret began to plan. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she was determined to give her daughters a life full of love and opportunities. What she didn't know was that fate had much bigger plans for her and her girls. Plans that would one day bring her back to Boston and bring Tony Prescott III to his knees. As the sun rose over the horizon, marking the start of a new day. Margaret Mason embraced her daughters and faced the future with a mixture of fear and determination. Her journey as a single mother of triplets was just beginning, and she was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The fall sun bathed the streets of Portland, Oregon, in a soft golden light. Margaret Mason adjusted her hat over her reddish-brown hair and smiled at the three girls walking beside her, each holding a colorful lunchbox tightly. "Ready for your first day at the new school?" Margaret asked, trying to disguise the nervousness in her voice. Sophia, the most outgoing of the triplets, jumped up and down with excitement. "Yes, Mom. I can't wait to make new friends." Ava, always the cautious one, squeezed Margaret's hand. "What if they don't like us?" Mia, the quiet and observant one, just looked at her mother with her big brown eyes, waiting for an answer. Margaret knelt down, making herself level with the girls. "Remember what I always say, you are strong, intelligent, and full of love. Anyone who doesn't like you is missing out on 3 incredible friends." The words seemed to calm the girls, and soon they were entering the gates of Oakwood Primary School, their backpacks swinging on their small backs. Margaret watched her daughters disappear into the building, feeling a mixture of pride and apprehension. 5 years had passed since that fateful night in Boston, and every day had been a struggle and a blessing. Leaving the hospital with 3 newborn girls and nowhere to go, Margaret had used her savings to rent a small apartment in the Boston suburbs. The first few months were a whirlwind of diapers, bottles, and sleepless nights. But Margaret was determined to create a loving home for her daughters. Working temporary jobs during the day and taking online courses at night, she managed to get a degree in business administration. It was during one of these courses that she met Rachel, a university professor who would become her best friend and mentor. Rachel not only helped Margaret find better job opportunities, but also encouraged her to pursue her dreams. "You have a gift for business, Liv," Rachel would often say. "Don't let circumstances limit you." Now, at 30, Margaret was the owner of a small but thriving event planning company. The move to Portland 6 months ago had been a difficult but necessary decision. The company was growing, and the West Coast offered new opportunities for expansion. In addition, Portland was far enough away from Boston that Margaret could breathe without the constant fear of bumping into Tony or his family. Sighing, Margaret turned and started walking towards her office, located a few blocks from the school. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, and she smiled when she saw Rachel's name on the screen. "How was the big day?" Rachel's excited voice sounded on the other end of the line. "They've just come in," Margaret replied, feeling the knot in her throat loosen a little. "They look so small and vulnerable. And they're the daughters of the strongest woman I know," Rachel added. "They'll do fine, Liv. You raised them to be resilient." Margaret laughed softly. "Sometimes I wonder if I did the right thing, moving so far away, starting from scratch." "Hey, none of that," Rachel interrupted her. "You're building an incredible future for yourself and the girls. Speaking of which, I have some news." Rachel's tone changed, becoming more serious. Margaret stopped walking, sensing that something important was coming. "Remember that contact I mentioned? The investor interested in expanding business on the West Coast." Margaret nodded, momentarily forgetting that Rachel couldn't see her. "Yes, of course. What about him?" "Well, he saw your portfolio and was impressed. He wants to set up a meeting next week." "Liv, this could be big." Margaret's heart raced. An opportunity like this could change everything. It would mean financial security for her daughters, the chance to expand the business. "Rachel, wow, I don't even know what to say." "Tell them you're going to rock this meeting," Rachel laughed. "Oh, and there's one more thing. The investor wants the meeting to be in San Francisco." Margaret felt a pang of anxiety. Traveling meant leaving the girls, something she rarely did. San Francisco, but the girls. "I've already thought of that," Rachel interrupted her. "How about I go to Portland for a few days? I can stay with the triplets while you're away. It'll be just like old times." Tears of gratitude welled up in Margaret's eyes. "Rachel, I don't know how to thank you." "Thank me by getting this investment," Rachel replied affectionately. You deserve it, Liv. You all deserve it." As she said goodbye to Rachel and resumed her walk to the office, Margaret felt a wave of determination wash over her. 5 years ago, she had been abandoned and left to fend for herself. Now, she was about to take a big step in her career, with a support network that made her feel invincible. What Margaret didn't know was that, thousands of kilometers away, in Boston, gears were turning. Tony Prescott III was looking out of the window of his office at Prescott Enterprises, an untouched glass of whiskey in his hand. His assistant had just left, leaving a file on his desk with information about a promising West Coast events company. The name on the cover of the file? Margaret Mason Events. Fate was about to entwine Margaret and Tony's paths once again, and this time the stakes would be much higher. The smooth sound of jazz filled the elegant restaurant on the 52nd floor of a skyscraper in San Francisco. Margaret Mason nervously adjusted the pearl necklace that adorned her neck, a gift from Rachel for good luck at this crucial meeting. Her navy blue dress, carefully chosen to convey professionalism and confidence, contrasted beautifully with her reddish-brown hair, now tied up in an elegant bun. "Miss Mason." A deep voice brought her out of her thoughts. Margaret turned to find a tall, middle-aged man with gray hair and a warm smile. "I'm Robert Caldwell. It's a pleasure to finally meet you in person." Margaret smiled, extending her hand to greet him. "The pleasure is all mine, Mr. Caldwell. Thank you for the opportunity to present my proposal." As they were led to their table, Margaret couldn't help but notice the look of approval on Robert's face. She knew that this meeting was her golden chance, the opportunity to take Margaret Mason Events to the next level. As the conversation flowed, Margaret was surprised at how easily she could articulate her vision for the company. Years of hard work and determination had given her a confidence she didn't even know she possessed. "I must admit, Miss Mason," Robert commented, as he savored his steak, "I'm impressed. Your expansion proposal is bold, but well-founded. I especially like the idea of incorporating sustainable elements into corporate events." Margaret nodded, feeling a surge of pride. "I believe that companies today don't just want memorable events, but also meaningful ones. Combining luxury with environmental responsibility is the future of the sector." Robert smiled, clearly pleased. "Well, it seems that Rachel didn't exaggerate when talking about you. I'm inclined to, His words were interrupted by a commotion near the entrance to the restaurant. Margaret turned to see what was happening and felt her heart stop. There, just a few meters away, was Tony Prescott III. Time seemed to freeze. Tony, impeccable in his Italian suit, was chatting animatedly with the maitre d'. He hadn't seen her yet, but it was only a matter of seconds. Margaret felt panic rise in her chest. 5 years had passed, but the pain of betrayal was still vivid. Her hands began to shake slightly, and she had to fight the urge to get up and run. "Miss Mason?" Robert's concerned voice brought her back to reality. "Are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." Margaret forced a smile, trying to pull herself together. "I apologize, Mr. Caldwell. I just thought I recognized someone." At that moment, as if fate were playing tricks on her, Tony's eyes swept the restaurant and landed directly on her. The surprise on his face was evident, followed quickly by an expression that Margaret couldn't decipher. Recognition, guilt, or something else. Tony muttered something to the maitre d' and started walking towards their table. Every step seemed to echo in Margaret's ears, bringing back memories she had fought so hard to bury. "Margaret?" Tony's voice sounded soft, almost hesitant. "I don't believe it. Is it really you?" Robert looked from Tony to Margaret, clearly confused by the situation. "You know each other?" Before Margaret could answer, Tony held out his hand to Robert. "Tony Prescott III, from Prescott Enterprises. Margaret and we met a few years ago in Boston." The name Prescott made Robert's eyes widen slightly. Clearly, he recognized the weight that surname carried in the business world. Margaret finally found her voice, although it was only a whisper. "Tony, what a surprise." The silence that followed was heavy with untold stories and unasked questions. Robert, sensing the tension, sniffled softly. "Well, since we all know each other, why don't you join us, Mr. Prescott? We were just discussing some interesting business." The invitation took Margaret by surprise. She wanted to protest, to say that the meeting was private, but the words stuck in her throat. Tony, on the other hand, seemed to hesitate for a moment before accepting, "If it's no trouble, I'd be happy to join you." As Tony settled in, Margaret felt as if she were in a surreal dream. There they were, her, the man who had abandoned her when she was pregnant with triplets, and a potential investor who could change the course of her career. Fate certainly had a peculiar sense of humor. Robert, oblivious to the complicated history between the two, resumed the business conversation with renewed enthusiasm. "Tony, you've arrived at an interesting time. Miss Mason was presenting me with a fascinating proposal to expand her events company." Tony raised an eyebrow, his eyes never leaving Margaret's face. "Events company. Impressive. It seems a lot has changed in recent years." The tone in his voice was impossible to decipher. Was there curiosity there? Perhaps even a hint of admiration? Or was it just Margaret projecting what she wanted to hear? Determined not to let the past ruin her chance, Margaret took a deep breath and decided to face the situation head-on. "Yes, Tony, a lot has changed. Life has an interesting way of surprising us, doesn't it?" There was a veiled challenge in his words, and she saw the exact moment when Tony caught it. His eyes narrowed slightly, a mixture of emotions passing through them too quickly for Margaret to decipher. Robert, sensing the dynamic changing, decided to intervene. "Well, since we're all here, why don't we take advantage of the opportunity? Tony, I'm sure your experience with Prescott Enterprises could offer a valuable perspective on Miss Mason's proposal." The rest of the evening unfolded like an intricate dance. Margaret presented her vision for Margaret Mason events with a passion and eloquence that surprised even herself. Tony, for his part, alternated between offering keen insights into the market and casting intrigued glances in Margaret's direction. As the meeting drew to a close, Robert seemed more than satisfied. "Miss Mason, I must say I'm impressed. Your vision, combined with your obvious passion for what you do, is exactly the kind of energy we're looking for. I think we may have the beginnings of a very promising partnership here." Margaret's heart soared at those words. She had done it. Even with Tony's unexpected presence, she hadn't let the past stand in the way of her future. As they said goodbye, Tony gently pulled her aside. "Margaret, there's so much I need to tell you. Can we talk? In private?" Margaret hesitated, a storm of emotions threatening to consume her. Part of her wanted to scream, to demand explanations for the years of neglect. Another part wanted to simply walk away and never look back. But there was also a small, almost inaudible voice that asked itself, "What if—" "Tomorrow," she finally replied, her voice steady despite the inner turmoil. "We can meet for coffee before my flight back to Portland." Tony nodded, a mixture of relief and anxiety in his eyes. "Thanks, Margaret. See you tomorrow, then." As Margaret left the restaurant, her mind was racing. What could Tony want after all these years? And more importantly, was she ready to listen? Back in her hotel room, Margaret called Rachel, desperate for a friendly ear. As she recounted the surreal events of the evening, she couldn't help wondering, was fate giving her a second chance? Or was it just setting the stage for more heartbreak? With a heavy heart and a restless mind, Margaret fell asleep, knowing that the next day could change everything again. The morning in San Francisco dawned gray and overcast, as if the sky itself reflected Margaret's emotional turmoil. She tightened her scarf around her neck, shielding herself from the cold breeze blowing in from the bay as she walked towards the small cafe where she had arranged to meet Tony. Her heart was pounding, a mixture of anxiety and resentment simmering in her chest. The memories of the night before, the shock of the reunion, the palpable tension during the business meeting were still vivid in her mind. As Margaret turned the corner, she saw him. Tony was sitting at an outside table, 2 steaming cups of coffee in front of him. He looked different in the daylight, older, tired, with small wrinkles around his eyes that hadn't been there 5 years ago. "Margaret." He stood up when he saw her, a hesitant smile on his lips. "Thank you for coming." She nodded stiffly, sitting down without offering a greeting. The silence that followed was heavy, laden with unspoken words and years of hurt. Tony was the first to break it. You look great, Margaret. Success suits you." Margaret raised an eyebrow, her voice cold as she finally spoke. "What do you want, Tony? After 5 years, why now?" He sighed deeply, running his hand through his hair in a gesture that Margaret recognized as nervousness. I wanted to apologize. I know it's not enough. It will probably never be enough. But what I did to you, to our children, it was unforgivable." The mention of the children made Margaret stiffen. "You're right. It is unforgivable." How are they?" Tony asked hesitantly. "The children, I mean." Margaret felt a wave of maternal protection wash over her. "They're fine. Happy, healthy, loved, no thanks to you." Tony lowered his eyes, the guilt evident on his face. "I deserve that. I deserve all your hatred, Margaret. But I need you to know, not a day goes by when I don't regret what I've done." "Regret?" Margaret laughed bitterly. "Regret doesn't pay the bills, Tony. It doesn't wake up in the middle of the night to feed hungry babies. It doesn't fight every day to give your daughters the life they deserve." Margaret's words seemed to hit Tony like a physical punch. He visibly cringed, the pain evident in his eyes. "I know," he whispered. "I know that nothing I say can make up for the lost years. But Margaret, you have to understand. My father, the pressure of the family business. I was young and stupid, and I made the biggest mistake of my life." Margaret shook her head in disbelief. "And you think that justifies it? Abandoning a pregnant woman, denying your own daughters?" Tony took a deep breath, as if gathering his courage. "No, it doesn't. Nothing justifies it. But Margaret, things have changed. I've changed. And when I saw you last night, so strong, so successful, I realized that I couldn't let this opportunity pass me by. I want to be part of their lives. Your life, if you let me." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret felt as if the world around her had stopped. Part of her wanted to scream, to throw Tony out of her life once again. But another part, a part she desperately tried to ignore, wondered, what if? "Why now, Tony?" she finally asked, her voice almost a whisper. "After all this time, why now?" Tony hesitated for a moment before answering. "Honestly, I've been thinking about it for a while. I tried to find you in Boston, but you'd already moved away. And then, last night, seeing you there, so fulfilled. It was like a slap in the face. I realized everything I'd lost, everything I'd thrown away." Margaret absorbed his words, a whirlwind of emotions threatening to consume her. Anger, hurt, confusion, and, surprisingly, a twinge of hope. "And what do you expect now, Tony? That I just forget everything and let you walk into the girls' lives as if nothing had happened?" He shook his head. "No, of course not. I know I don't deserve any of this. But maybe we could start slowly? I'd like to get to know them, Margaret, to be a part of their lives, even if it's just as a distant family friend." Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, trying to organize her thoughts. When she opened them again, her mind was made up. "Listen, Tony, I can't deny the girls the right to meet their father, but it will be on my terms. I'll talk to them first, explain the situation as best I can. If, and only if, they want to meet you, then we can arrange something." The relief on Tony's face was palpable. "Thank you, Margaret. It's more than I deserve." She nodded stiffly. "You're right. It's more than you deserve. And Tony, if you hurt them, if you abandon them again, there won't be a third chance. Understand?" "Perfectly," he replied, the seriousness evident in his voice. As they stood up to say goodbye, Tony hesitated for a moment. "Margaret, there's something else you should know. About the meeting last night. Margaret froze, a new kind of fear taking hold of her. What about the meeting? Tony took a deep breath before continuing. Robert Caldwell. He's not just an independent investor. He represents an investment group of which Prescott Enterprises is a part. The shock hit Margaret like an icy wave. You mean? Yes, Tony confirmed. If the deal goes ahead, Prescott Enterprises will be part owner of Margaret Mason Events. Margaret felt the world spin around her. Everything she had worked so hard for over the last 5 years, all her hard-won independence. And now, somehow, Tony would be linked to it. I need to think, she muttered, taking a step back. This is too much, Tony. He nodded, understanding. I understand. Take all the time you need. But Margaret, whatever you decide about the business, my offer about the girls remains. I want to be part of their lives, if you let me. With one last look full of conflicting emotions, Margaret turned and walked quickly away, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts and her heart heavy with impossible decisions. As she walked away, Tony watched her, a mixture of hope and regret in his eyes. He knew he had a long way to go to win Margaret's trust and a place in his daughters' lives. But for the first time in 5 years, he felt that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance of redemption. The flight back to Portland had never seemed so long to Margaret. As the clouds rolled past the plane's window, she found herself at a crossroads. Accepting the investment would mean a huge leap forward for her company, but it would also tie her irrevocably to Tony and the past she had fought so hard to overcome. Refusing could mean losing a unique opportunity, but it would maintain the independence she had fought so hard for. And then there was the question of the girls. How would she explain to them that the father they had never met now wanted to be part of their lives? How would she protect them from possible future disappointments? When the plane finally landed in Portland, Margaret had more questions than answers, but she knew one thing for sure: whatever her decision, it would be based on what was best for her daughters. They were, and always would be, her number one priority. The joyful sound of children's laughter echoed through the living room of Margaret's cozy Portland home. Sophia, Ava, and Mia, now 5, were playing animatedly with Rachel, who had stayed for dinner after looking after them during Margaret's trip. Watching the scene from the kitchen, Margaret felt her heart squeeze. The girls seemed so happy, so carefree. How could she introduce such a significant change into their lives? So, are you going to tell me what's bothering you? Rachel asked quietly, joining Margaret in the kitchen. You've barely touched dinner and you've been distracted since you got back from San Francisco. Margaret sighed, running a hand through her hair. Rachel, you won't believe what happened. Over the next few minutes, Margaret recounted the surreal events of the last few days. The unexpected reunion with Tony, the investment proposal that could change everything, and Tony's request to be part of the girls' lives. Rachel listened intently, her eyes widening with each new revelation. When Margaret finished, a heavy silence fell over the kitchen, broken only by the distant laughter of the children. Wow, Rachel finally said. That's a lot to process. Margaret nodded, feeling the weight of the decisions she needed to make. I don't know what to do, Rachel. On the one hand, the investment would be incredible for the company. We could expand, reach markets I've always dreamed of, but that would mean having Tony back in your life, Rachel added softly. Exactly, Margaret sighed. And that's not all. How do I explain it to the girls? They've never asked about their father, you know, and now, out of the blue, he wants to be a part of their lives. Rachel put a comforting hand on Margaret's shoulder. Look, I can't tell you what to do, but I know you live. You always put the girls first. Whatever decision you make, I know it will be with their best interests in mind. At that moment, Mia, the most observant of the triplets, entered the kitchen. Her big brown eyes, so similar to Margaret's, were full of curiosity. Mommy, are you sad? She asked, her small voice full of concern. Margaret knelt down, hugging her daughter tightly. No, darling. Mommy's just thinking about some important things. Mia hugged her back, her innocence an anchor amidst Margaret's storm of emotions. It's okay, Mom. You always sort everything out." Her daughter's simple words brought tears to Margaret's eyes. She looked at Rachel, who nodded encouragingly. "I think it's time to have a talk with them," Margaret said softly. Minutes later, the three girls were sitting on the sofa, looking curiously at Margaret. Rachel stood nearby, offering silent support. "Girls," Margaret began, her voice shaking slightly, "remember how we sometimes talk about different families? How some children have a daddy and a mommy, others have two mommies or two daddies, and some, like you, have only one mommy?" The girls nodded, still not fully understanding where the conversation was going. "Well, something happened during my trip. I met your father." The silence that followed was deafening. Sophia, always the most outgoing, was the first to speak. "We have a father." Margaret nodded, feeling her heart squeeze. "Yes, dear, everyone has a father, even if he's not always around." Ava, the more cautious one, frowned. "Why hasn't he come to see us before?" The question Margaret dreaded the most. She took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "Sometimes adults make mistakes. Your father. He wasn't ready to be a father when you were born, but now he says he wants to meet you." The reactions were varied. Sophia seemed excited by the idea, already asking 1,000 questions about what he was like. Ava shrank back, clearly suspicious of the situation. Mia, as always, watched silently, her eyes going from Margaret to her sisters. "You don't have to decide anything now," Margaret assured her. "It's big news, and we all need time to think about it." That night, after Rachel had left and the girls had finally fallen asleep, Margaret found herself sitting on her bed, phone in hand. She knew she needed to make a decision about the investment, and fast. With a deep sigh, she dialed Robert Caldwell's number. "Mr. Caldwell, it's Margaret Mason. I've made a decision about the investment." On the other end of the line, Robert listened intently as Margaret explained her conditions. When she finished, there was a moment of silence before he answered. "I understand your concerns, Ms. Mason. Your proposal is unconventional, but given the potential we see in your company, I believe we can reach an agreement." Margaret felt a weight come off her shoulders. "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell. I really believe this is the best decision for everyone involved." After hanging up, Margaret looked at the picture of the triplets on her bedside table. She knew the road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in days, she felt a spark of hope. The next day, she would make another call, this time to Tony. She would establish clear rules for her involvement in the girls' lives. It would be a slow, cautious process, always prioritizing her daughter's emotional well-being. Meanwhile, in Boston, Tony Prescott III looked out of his office window, a glass of untouched whiskey in his hand. His assistant had just left, leaving a detailed report on Margaret Mason events on his desk. Tony picked up the report, flipping through it absent-mindedly. Every page showed Margaret's success and determination, reminding him of everything he had lost because of her cowardice years ago. His phone rang, startling him. It was his father, Tony Prescott II. "Son, I've heard rumors about a new investment on the West Coast. Something about an events company. I want all the details on my desk in the morning." Tony hesitated, his mind racing. He still hadn't told his father about Margaret, about the children. He knew the reaction wouldn't be good. "Of course, Dad. I'll have everything ready for you." Hanging up the phone, Tony felt the weight of his past and future decisions. He knew that the next few days would be crucial. He would have to face his father, fight for the right to know his daughters, and perhaps, if he was lucky, begin to repair the damage he had caused so many years ago. With a determined sigh, Tony picked up a pen and began to write. Not to his father, but to 3 girls he had never met, but who he already loved more than he could express. "Dear Sophia, Ava, and Mia," he began, knowing that these could be the most important words he had ever written in his life. Autumn in Portland painted the streets in shades of red and gold, a fitting backdrop for the changes that were taking place in the lives of Margaret Mason and her daughters. 3 months had passed since the fateful conversation in San Francisco, and Margaret's world seemed to be spinning on a new axis. Margaret Mason Events was flourishing with the new investment. The Portland office had been expanded, and a new branch in Seattle was about to open. Margaret found herself immersed in meetings, planning and hiring, deftly balancing her role as a budding entrepreneur with that of devoted mother. That Saturday morning, as she prepared breakfast for the girls, Margaret reflected on the turbulent weeks that had followed her decision. The negotiations with Robert Caldwell had been intense, but in the end, they had reached an agreement that protected Margaret's autonomy while taking advantage of Prescott Enterprises' resources. "Mom, when are we going to see Dad again?" Sophia's voice interrupted her thoughts. Margaret turned around to find 3 pairs of curious eyes fixed on her. Tony's visits had begun cautiously, first with supervised meetings in a local park, then progressing to casual lunches. The girls' reactions varied. Sophia was enthusiastic, Ava still suspicious, and Mia watched everything with her keen eyes, absorbing every detail. "He's coming to visit us this afternoon, remember?" Margaret replied, placing a plate of pancakes on the table. "We're having a picnic in the park." Ava frowned, poking at her pancake with her fork. "Do I have to go?" Margaret's heart squeezed. She knelt beside her daughter, gently stroking her hair. "Darling, I know this is difficult and confusing, but giving your father a chance doesn't mean you're betraying our family. It's okay to have mixed feelings about it." Mia, silent as ever, reached out and took Ava's hand. "It's okay, Ava. We'll be together." Margaret smiled, amazed at her daughter's maturity. They had faced this change in their lives with a resilience that constantly surprised her. Hours later, in the park, Margaret watched from afar as Tony played with the girls. He had brought a colorful kite and was now trying to teach them how to fly it. Sophia was laughing happily, running around. Even Ava seemed to be enjoying herself, her normally serious face lit up with a reluctant smile. "He's trying hard," a familiar voice commented next to her. Margaret turned to see Rachel, who had come to join them for the picnic. Margaret nodded, her eyes never leaving the scene in front of her. "Yes, he is, but I still have my moments of doubt. You know, what if he hurts them again?" Rachel put a comforting hand on Margaret's shoulder. "It's natural to be afraid, but look at them, Liv. You raised them to be strong and resilient. Whatever happens, they'll be fine." At that moment, Tony looked in her direction, a hesitant smile on his face. Margaret returned the smile, surprised by the ease of the gesture. The last few weeks had been an emotional roller coaster, but seeing the joy on her daughters' faces, she couldn't deny that she had made the right choice. Later that evening, after the girls had gone to bed, Margaret found herself sitting on her balcony, a cup of tea in her hands. The soft sound of footsteps alerted her to the presence of Tony, who had stayed to help clean up after the picnic. "They're amazing, Margaret," he said softly, taking a seat in the chair next to her. "You've done an amazing job with them." Margaret nodded, a mixture of pride and melancholy in her voice. "They're my life, Tony. Everything I've done, every decision I've made in the last 5 years, has been for them." Tony was silent for a moment, his eyes fixed on the horizon. When he spoke again, his voice was charged with emotion. "I know I can't undo the past, Margaret, but I want you to know, I'm committed to it. To them. To being the father they deserve." Margaret studied him, noticing the lines of concern on his face, the sincerity in his eyes. "I believe in you, Tony. But understand, it's going to take time. Trust can't be rebuilt overnight." He nodded, a small smile on his lips. "I know that, and I'm ready for it. I'm going to prove to you, to them, that I've changed." The silence that followed was no longer as tense or uncomfortable as before. It was a silence of mutual understanding, of 2 people navigating new territory together. "How are things in Boston?" Margaret asked, breaking the silence. "Your father," Tony sighed heavily. "He's not happy, to say the least. He thinks I'm letting feelings get in the way of business. But for the first time in my life, Margaret, I don't care what he thinks. This, our daughters, is more important than any corporate empire." Margaret felt a surge of respect for Tony. She knew how much her father's approval had always meant to him. "What about the company?" Tony asked, turning to face her. I hear the expansion to Seattle is going well. Margaret couldn't contain her proud smile. It's going better than we expected. The investment came at the right time. We're even considering a possible expansion to California next year. Tony smiled, genuinely happy for her. That's incredible, Margaret. You've built something really special. They continued talking about business and future plans, the conversation flowing with an ease that surprised them both. When Tony finally got up to leave, there was a new understanding between them. Thank you for today, Margaret, he said softly, for giving me this chance. Margaret nodded, a small smile on her lips. Good night, Tony. As she watched him go, Margaret reflected on how her life had changed over the last few months. The road ahead was still uncertain, full of challenges and possible pitfalls. But for the first time in a long time, she felt truly hopeful about the future. Inside the house, the soft sound of giggling caught her attention. Peeking into the girls' room, she saw Sophia, Ava, and Mia snuggled together on Mia's bed, whispering and laughing softly. Hey, what are you three doing up? Margaret asked, trying to sound stern but failing miserably. We were talking about today, Sophia replied, her eyes sparkling with excitement. It was fun, wasn't it? Ava, surprisingly, nodded in agreement. Daddy's good at making kites fly. Mia, ever the observer, looked deeply into Margaret's eyes. Are you happy, Mom? The question took Margaret by surprise. She sat on the edge of the bed, pulling her three girls into a tight hug. Yes, darling, Mommy's happy. And do you know why? Because I have you three. As she rocked her daughters back to sleep, Margaret felt a peace she hadn't experienced for years. The future was uncertain, but with her girls by her side and a new understanding with Tony, she felt ready to face any challenge that came her way. Across town, in his hotel room, Tony looked at a photo of the girls that Margaret had given him. His heart was filled with a love he never knew he could feel. With renewed determination, he picked up his phone and dialed a familiar number. Dad, we need to talk. There are some changes that need to happen in the company. Autumn in Portland continued to paint the city with its vibrant colors, a constant reminder that change, although sometimes frightening, could bring unexpected beauty. Winter arrived in Portland with unexpected fury, covering the city in a blanket of snow that paralyzed the streets and closed schools. For Margaret Mason, however, the real storm was happening inside her home. I don't want to go. Ava's voice echoed through the living room, full of frustration and hurt. Why do we have to spend Christmas in Boston? Margaret sighed, massaging her temples. The last few weeks had been an emotional roller coaster. Her relationship with Tony was progressing slowly, but the idea of spending the holidays with the Prescott family in Boston had triggered a series of conflicts she hadn't anticipated. Darling, Margaret began, trying to remain calm. Your father wants you to meet the rest of the family. It's important to him. Sophia, always the most enthusiastic, jumped up and down excitedly. It's going to be fun, Ava. We can make giant snowmen. Mia, as always, watched silently, her eyes going from one sister to the other, only to land on her mother. The sound of the doorbell interrupted the discussion. Margaret opened the door to find Tony, covered in snow and carrying 3 colorful boxes. Ho, 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 he joked, entering the room. I thought I'd bring some early presents to cheer the girls up before the trip. Ava's face immediately closed up. I don't want any presents. I don't want to go to Boston. Tony's cheerful expression faltered, giving way to a mixture of pain and worry. Margaret felt her heart squeeze. Over the last few months, she had witnessed Tony's genuine effort to connect with the girls, especially the reluctant Ava. Hey, princess. Tony knelt down in front of Ava, his voice soft. I know it's a big change, but how about we make a deal? If you don't like it, we can come back sooner. What do you think? Ava hesitated, her eyes meeting Margaret's in search of reassurance. Margaret nodded encouragingly. All right, Ava murmured at last. But you promise? I promise, Tony replied solemnly, extending his little finger. Ava wrapped her own pinky around his, sealing the deal. Later that night, with the girls finally in bed, Margaret and Tony met in the kitchen, each with a cup of hot chocolate in their hands. Do you think we're doing the right thing? Margaret asked, her voice low so as not to wake the children. Taking them to Boston, introducing them to their father. Tony sighed, running his hand through his hair in a gesture that Margaret had learned to recognize as a sign of nervousness. Honestly, I'm not sure. But I do know that I can't keep two lives apart forever. They're my daughters, Margaret. Part of the Prescott family, whether they like it or not. Margaret nodded, understanding Tony's dilemma. Over the last few months, she had witnessed his struggle to balance his responsibilities in Boston with his desire to be present in the girls' lives in Portland. "How are things going at the company?" she asked, changing the subject. Tony's face lit up. "Actually, I have some news. Remember that idea we discussed about expanding Margaret Mason events to large-scale corporate events?" Margaret straightened up, intrigued. "Yes, of course. What about it?" "Well, I presented the proposal to the board of Prescott Enterprises. Margaret, they loved it. They want to make it an official partnership, expand the operation to the East Coast." Margaret's heart raced. It was an incredible opportunity, something she could only have dreamed of a few years ago. "But, Tony, wow. But what about your father? Did he approve?" Tony's expression became more serious. "It was complicated. He still has reservations about our family arrangement, but he couldn't deny the business potential. In the end, business logic prevailed." Margaret absorbed the information, her mind racing with the possibilities and challenges that this new opportunity presented. "That would change a lot of things," she muttered, more to herself than to Tony. "I know," he replied softly. "And I understand if you need time to think. But Margaret, I believe we can make this work, for the business and for our family." The word family made Margaret look at Tony in surprise. It was the first time he had referred to all of them in that way. Before she could reply, a high-pitched scream came from the girls' bedroom. Within seconds, they were both on their feet, running to see what had happened. They found Mia sitting on her bed, silent tears streaming down her face. Sophia and Ava were already by her side, trying to comfort her. "It was just a bad dream, sweetheart," Margaret whispered, hugging Mia. "It's all right now." Tony stood in the doorway for a moment, uncertain of his place in this familiar scene. But then, to everyone's surprise, Mia held out her hand to him. "Daddy," she called softly, her voice laced with tears. Tony's heart seemed to stop for a second. It was the first time Mia had called him Dad. He came closer, sitting on the edge of the bed and holding his daughter's small hand. "I'm here, Princess," he murmured, his voice full of emotion. "Daddy's here." Margaret watched the scene, feeling a complex mixture of emotions. Seeing Tony comforting Mia, with Sophia and Ava snuggled around her, was an image she had never imagined witnessing. At that moment, looking at her unlikely and imperfect family, Margaret made her decision. "Let's do it," she said softly to Tony. "The expansion to the East Coast. Let's try it." Tony looked at her, surprised and thrilled. "Are you sure?" Margaret nodded, a small smile on her lips. "I'm sure. But we'll do it our way, for the business and for our family." The words hung in the air, laden with promise and possibility. The trip to Boston now carried a new meaning, not just a family visit, but the start of a new chapter in their lives. As the girls drifted back to sleep, Margaret and Tony remained in the bedroom, each lost in their own thoughts. The future was uncertain, full of challenges and possible conflicts. The Prescott patriarch, business expansion, the balance between two cities, all this awaited them. But that night, watching her daughters sleeping peacefully, Margaret felt a surge of determination. They would face every challenge together, as a family. The storm might be coming, but she was confident that they would find their rainbow in the end. Outside, the snow continued to fall softly over Portland, covering the city in a pure white blanket. It was as if nature was offering a blank canvas, ready for them to paint their new story. The summer sun bathed the garden of the Prescott Mansion in Boston, illuminating a scene that, just 2 years ago, would have seemed impossible. Margaret Mason, elegant in a navy blue dress, watched with a smile as the triplets ran across the lawn, chasing colorful balloons. "What do you know?" Rachel's voice snapped her out of her thoughts. Her longtime friend was standing next to her, a glass of champagne in her hand and a knowing smile on her lips. Margaret laughed softly. "Sometimes I still pinch myself to make sure I'm not dreaming." The sound of children's laughter caught her attention again. Sophia, Ava, and Mia, now 7, were engaged in a lively treasure hunt, organized by none other than Tony Prescott II, the once feared patriarch of the family. "Grandpa, Grandpa!" Sophia shouted, running towards the gray-haired man. "We've found another clue." Old Prescott smiled, a glint of genuine affection in his eyes. "Very good, my dear. Let's see what it says." Margaret was still marveling at the man's transformation. At first reluctant and cold, Tony II had gradually surrendered to the irresistible charm of his granddaughters. What had begun as a reluctant acceptance out of business necessity had turned into a genuine and deep love. "Mrs. Mason?" A young assistant approached, interrupting her thoughts. "There's a call for you. It's from Portland." Margaret nodded, apologizing to Rachel before turning away to take the call. It was Miranda, her manager in Portland, with updates on Margaret Mason Events' latest event. Over the last 2 years, the company had grown beyond Margaret's most optimistic expectations. The expansion to the East Coast, facilitated by the partnership with Prescott Enterprises, had opened doors that Margaret never imagined possible. Now, with offices in Portland, Boston, New York, and, most recently, Chicago, Margaret Mason Events was recognized as one of the leading event planning companies in the country. While discussing the final details of the event with Miranda, Margaret couldn't help but reflect on her journey. Every challenge, every obstacle overcome, had led her to this moment. "Everything okay here?" Tony's voice surprised her. He approached, gently placing a hand on her back. Margaret smiled, leaning slightly into his touch. "Yes, just checking on the final preparations for the Portland event." Tony nodded, a glint of pride in his eyes. "You've built something incredible, Margaret. I never cease to be impressed by your talent and determination." The warmth of his words enveloped her. Over the last 2 years, they had navigated turbulent waters together, rebuilding trust, balancing the demands of their careers with the needs of the girls, facing the scrutiny of Boston society. None of it had been easy. But with each step, they had grown closer, forging not only a successful business partnership, but also a relationship based on mutual respect, understanding, and yes, love. "We built it together," Margaret replied softly. "I would never have gotten this far without you by my side." The moment was interrupted by an excited shout from Ava. "Mommy, Daddy! Come and see what we found." Exchanging smiles, Margaret and Tony joined the girls, who had discovered an ornate box hidden under a bush. "The ultimate treasure," Mia exclaimed, her eyes shining with excitement. With the girls gathered around him, Tony carefully opened the box. Inside were 3 delicate necklaces, each with a heart-shaped pendant. "Oh, Daddy," Sophia whispered in amazement. "They're beautiful." Tony smiled, his eyes filling with unshed tears. "These necklaces belong to my grandmother," he explained softly. "She always said that one day they would be given to the most important women in the Prescott family. And who could be more important than you 3? As Tony carefully placed the necklaces on each of the girls, Margaret felt her heart overflow with emotion. Seeing her daughters, so happy and loved, she couldn't help but think of the frightened young girl she was 7 years ago, alone and pregnant, abandoned in a hospital. "Hey," Tony's soft voice brought her back to the present. "Where were you?" Margaret smiled, tears of happiness shining in her eyes. "Just thinking about how we got here, all the twists and turns that brought us to this moment." Tony nodded, understanding. He took Margaret's hand, intertwining their fingers. "You know, there's something I've been wanting to ask you for a while." Margaret's heart raced. She had an idea of what was coming, but still, when Tony knelt in front of her, taking a small velvet box from his pocket, she felt the world stop. "Margaret Mason," he began, his voice trembling slightly with emotion. You have given me the greatest gift a man could ask for, a second chance. A chance to be a father, to be a better man. You showed me the true meaning of strength, forgiveness, and unconditional love. I love you, I love our daughters, and I can't imagine spending the rest of my life with anyone but you. Margaret, would you do me the honor of marrying me? For a moment, Margaret was speechless. She looked at Tony, at her daughters who were watching the scene with wide eyes, at Rachel and the other guests who had gathered around. All the way from that fateful night in hospital to this perfect moment flashed through her mind. With tears streaming freely down her face, Margaret finally found her voice. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Tony. Yes, I'll marry you." The girls burst into shouts of joy, running to hug their parents. Rachel clapped enthusiastically, while Tony Prescott II gave a rare, broad smile. When Tony slid the ring onto Margaret's finger, a dazzling solitaire, which, she noted with excitement, matched the girls' necklaces perfectly, she felt as if everything in her life had finally fallen into place. Later that evening, with the party still in full swing, Margaret found a moment of tranquility on the terrace of the mansion. Looking out at the lights of Boston, she reflected on her journey. From a scared and lonely young girl to a successful businesswoman and now fiancé. Every challenge, every obstacle had shaped her, made her stronger. "A penny for your thoughts," Tony murmured, joining her and wrapping his arms around her. Margaret snuggled into him, feeling safe and loved. Just thinking about how unpredictable life is. 7 years ago, if someone had told me we'd be here today. Tony laughed softly. "I know. Sometimes I still wonder if I deserve all this." Margaret turned to face him, placing a hand on his cheek. "You deserve it, Tony. We deserve it. We built this together. With honesty, hard work, and love." At that moment, the triplets came running, their laughter echoing through the night. "Mommy, Daddy, Grandpa says we can let off lanterns in the garden." Exchanging smiles, Margaret and Tony followed their daughters back to the party. As they walked hand in hand, Margaret felt a deep sense of peace and contentment. The future was bright, full of promise and possibility. As the lanterns rose into the night sky, illuminating the garden with a soft glow, Margaret said a silent prayer of gratitude for her daughters, for Tony, for Rachel, for all the people and experiences that had brought her to this perfect moment. The journey hadn't been easy, but every step, every challenge had been worth it. And now, surrounded by her family, both the one she had raised and the one she had met along the way, Margaret knew that, no matter what the future held, they would face it together. The lanterns continued to rise, points of light against the dark sky, symbolizing new beginnings, hopes, and dreams. And as Margaret watched, hugging Tony and with her daughters by her side, she knew with certainty this was not an ending, but the beginning of a new and exciting chapter in their lives.